The origin of the banquet was to provide a feast for the poor, and as the class under this category was known to be not a very large one, the arrangements were of a proportionately moderate extent. But as this scheme became more developed, it was resolved to depart from the original intention and to make it a free feast for the whole community. These festivities were almost beyond description. The natural beauty of the gardens, combined with the luxuriant foliage of trees and shrubs, and the artistic arrangements of various coloured lanterns, made for the time of fairyland on terra firma. In the centre of the gardens there stood a canopy. Close to this canopy and within a railed-in enclosure was the wine fountain, supplied from a 500-gallon cask, furnished by Mr. Knight, Mr. Beer and Mr. Adams. The guest of honour, His Royal Highness, was to be offered a goblet of colonial wine, an excessively elegant gold cup kindly furnished for the occasion by Mr. Edward Hart. A pavilion had also been prepared for the expected royal visitor. The furniture had been supplied by Mr. Beauchamp and Roque. The bread, that important part of a good meal, had been baked by Mr. D. Cameron of Victoria Street from a large quantity of first-class flour, furnished by Mr. de Graves, Ramsden, Gibson, Walker and others. In the meat department, the principal contributors were Mr. Petty and Bignell, furnishing 2 splendid Mr. Gardner added a large quantity of mutton and lamb, in addition to a fine bullock, beautifully dressed for the purpose of being roasted whole. Of bulk ale, there were 6 hogsheads, including beef, supplied by Mr. Mitchell, the whole provision Terry, 4,500 pounds there was a goodly store indeed. By 11 o'clock, the paddock was full of people eagerly making their way towards the reserve. Up to 1 o'clock, the entrances to the ground where the banquet was to be held were kept carefully closed, policemen resolutely refusing admittance to all except those connected with the management of the feast. At 1 o'clock, however, these restrictions were removed and the eager crowd entered the reserve intent on those 2 great passions of human nature: sightseeing and eating and drinking. The population of the state was 600,000. 10,000 people were expected to show. As many as 80,000 people showed up on the day. By 2 o'clock there was, judging from the grumblings of the crowd, nothing whatsoever left to eat, and expressions of disapproval became louder than ever. The expectation of his arrival were kept up until 4 o'clock, when the prince left the Port Phillip Farmers Society show and was driven at once towards Richmond. Within a few hundred yards of the scene of the free banquet, he was met by police officials, who represented to His Royal Highness that in consequence of the enormous crowd there assembled and in interest of public safety, the prince should not attend the banquet. The prince, being a noble man of upstanding character, graciously heeded the officer's warnings. And after that, the disappointment of the crowd was changed to something more akin to anger, as they contemplated at their leisure what they considered a decided hardship. Shortly before 5 o'clock, when it became generally known that the prince was not coming, all the reserved tents were rushed. The tent of one Mr. Grimwood, where a large quantity of wine and beer had been stored, was also rushed, and in a few moments the tent was levelled to the ground, and its contents distributed amongst the crowd. After this, the confusion became 10,000 times worse confounded. Some climbed into the tree where the cask of wine supplying the fountain was placed, and, cutting the pipes, distributed the contents liberally over the crowd. Others again managed to ascend the canopy erected over the table prepared for the prince, and from that lofty position opened a heavy fire of chaff upon the crowd below, while the rest of the invited occupied themselves in discussing the liquor to which they had helped themselves. As for getting anything to eat, it was by this time impossible, for the advertised miles of tables had long been cleared and the waitresses dispersed, while the members of the committee, the steward and others had removed their distinguishing badges and mingled with the crowd. And yet, with all this confusion, there was no absolute ill-temper display. The mob seemed to think they were behaving in a perfectly justifiable manner. Perhaps, too, they were not without some reason for so thinking. After all, they were invited guests. And when one asks another to the house, firstly to meet a distinguished guest and secondly to eat a good dinner, the invited person has some reason to complain when they can neither see one nor eat the other. About 5:30 o'clock, things began to simmer. The remainder of the wine and beer having been sent off the ground under guard of police, Inspector Hare, with a large force of mounted and foot, began to clear the reserve, and after a little time succeeded in doing so. Before 6:30 o'clock their task was nearly completed, and numerous groups, wending their way home, were soon all that was left of the long-expected banquet.